So if I come in here and click on this item, you'll notice that the border changed, and I can highlight and edit the content within this control. So if I just change something that's in here and mouse out of the control, you'll notice it updates again. It's got that pink border and the grayed out text, and then as soon as our changes have been submitted, it goes back to the UI of an unaltered state. So what happened there was as we clicked out of that control, there was an Ajax request that went back to the server and updated our data and persisted our changes, and that was all done without any sort of explicit submission of data. We didn't click on any buttons. We didn't click on a next button. It was all done in a sort of live type of format. That's what gives the pattern its name, the live form. So if I were to refresh my page, we can see that it has been persisted, the data is there. And also there's a different way of dealing with some of these controls. This, what you see right here, this item, this control is an input. It's a text box that's been styled to look read-only in the beginning. Some of the other controls, that's not exactly the type of experience you want. So we have a span here, and once you click on that span, we hide it and then show a web date chooser control, which allows you to change the date here using the same type of approach that we've gotten. We can refresh to see that it has been persisted, the changes to our data. So that's the demo. Let's go ahead and get started and show you how to build it. Okay, well, to kick things off, what I'd like to do is begin by implementing the title editor. And so there's a couple things we need on the page. First of all, we're going to need a script manager. And this is necessary for a couple reasons. Number one, doing anything Ajax in ASP.NET, if you're going to use the stock controls, you pretty much need a script manager for about anything that you're going to do. But also what we'll be doing is taking advantage of the page methods. And so that'll allow us to write some code in the code behind and expose it up to the client and allow that to be callable through Ajax. So we're going to say enable page methods and set that equal to true. Next, what we'll do is create a hidden input form. And what this will do is basically act as a container for the primary key for any one of the items that we're looking at. So this is just an easy way to set aside the primary key value, even though we're not going to show it to the user, but have a place to put it. So we'll stick it in an input control, and the type will be hidden. And the ID will be book ID. And the value we'll get at in just a moment. Okay, so then the next thing that we need is our actual text box itself. And so we'll use the web text edit control. So let's go ahead and get one of those and bring it onto the page here. So I'm using NetAdvantage 2008 Volume 3. And we need the web text edit. Here we go. Drag that on there. And then what I'm going to do for right now is just stick this within the div tag so it has its own space on the screen. It's its own blocking. So the ID for this will just be text title, and then we're going to do a couple things here. I'm going to clean up the markup by getting rid of the end tag and have it self-closing, because I like my markup to be really nice and terse. And then what we'll do is we'll implement some JavaScript functions in order to give it the interaction that we want. So on focus, we will run txt title focus, of all things. On blur, it'll be basically the same thing. And on click, something familiar. Okay, so what I'm doing is creating pointers to JavaScript functions that we'll implement in a moment that will allow us to have the kind of interaction you saw in the demo. So the next thing, the last thing that I want to do is just give this a width, and for right now we'll just say it's 800 pixels. Okay. Now I'm going to type just about all the code that's necessary in order to make this happen, except for one section, and that is the style sheet, just because there's a little bit here, and I'll go through each one, but I don't think seeing me type it and explain line by line is necessarily all that interesting. So we're styling the body. All we're doing basically is giving it a font, some size, and some margin. It's just basically some basic stuff to make things look good. We have a published label. If you remember, it showed the Craig's book, and then it said published, and then the date after that. This label, this ID here, will place that label in the right spot. The date and date control gives us some styling for where the data itself is, the one that you click on, and also the web date chooser that we're going to stick on there. Big is just a class to make the text bigger. Display none. This is something you're constantly using when you want to hide and show things on the page. And then the progression for how our controls will go, that's a little out of order, but it'll go live input, live edit, and then live input dirty. Live input edit, I guess. So basically when it's in an unaltered state, it's the live input class is being applied to it. Then it'll go to live input edit, and if you look at what's specific about this one, we're basically going to stick a dashed border on there so people can tell you're in edit mode. And then when we're in the dirty state, what will happen is we're going to put a pink colored border around it and make the text kind of a light gray, just so people get an idea. So we're just setting up our initial border in the text line. The reason initially we're setting the border to 1 pixel solid and then white is because if you have no border and then stick a border on there, things will start to move around. So in order so that doesn't happen, we're going to have a white border on there, and then when you hover over it, it'll turn green, and when you're editing it, it will turn dashed to kind of a gray color, and then finally once it's dirty and you're submitting the changes to the server, it'll be a pink, and we're changing the text to just a regular light gray type of color. So that's the style sheet. So now that we have the style sheet, then the next part that makes sense to go in is start putting in some of the JavaScript. So we'll open up a text block here. And we're going to start by adding in some functions that are kind of helper functions to make everything happen. So kind of in the spirit of jQuery, what I wanted to do is have some functions that allow us to add CSS classes and remove them. So we'll create the first one here, and we'll call this add CSS class. And we'll pass into it a control and also the CSS name. So this is a class name, basically. So this one's pretty easy. Basically, to add the CSS class, all we need to do is look at the control itself and basically append the class name that we stick on there. So let's declare a variable C, and what we're doing here, we're going to take a look at the control. Oh, I misspelled my variable name up here. Okay. So we're going to take a look at the control, and we want to take a look and see if it has the element. Now this is something that's specific to our Infragistics client-side object model. If we're looking at an Infragistics control, we want to look at the element and its class name. Otherwise, if it's something that we've done for a $get or get element by ID, we won't need that. So if we have control.element, then we'll return CTL element. Otherwise, we'll just return the control itself. Okay? And then at that point, what we can do is take a look at the class name, and we'll just append what we've got here. We'll stick some spacing in there. Because of the way CSS works is that if you have multiple classes, you have to separate them by the space. And then we're going to stick a space on both ends so that depending on whether it's the first one you add or the second one or wherever, you get the correct spacing. So that's what we need for add the CSS class, and then we'll implement the one for removing a CSS class. Again, we'll pass in the control and the class name. And to make this happen, what we'll do is we'll take a look at the CSS class names that are already applied to this control. We'll split them based off of the space, and then basically build the list back up again, add them back in, but skipping the one that we're passing in. So in effect, we're removing it. So we'll declare a variable, and this is the same line that we've had up here before. So let's go ahead and just copy this instead of typing it up. And then from there, what we'll do is split the classes out and add that into a variable. So splitting on space. So then what we'll do is loop through the array of classes. Oops. Okay, so we'll look at the current one that we're on. So class is I. If that doesn't equal the class name, we need one more variable here. So we have basically the list that we're going to be building up. Initialize that as a blank string, and then what we can do is use that to append together the one we're looking at. Okay, and then we're going to separate with a space so that everything works together. Now once we have that list, we'll find our control and we'll say class name equals CSS class, and then we've implemented the remove CSS class functionality. Okay, so now that we have those utility functions available, what we can do is go in and start implementing specific for our title editor. So what we want to do is make sure that when we do our Ajax call, we're only making the call if things have changed. So let's create a variable called old val. And so what we'll do is before we do any edits, we'll set aside what the old value was, and then we can take a look at that before we make our Ajax call to make sure that something has in fact changed before we try to call back to the server. So the next thing we need is our focus function. If you remember down here, we created all of these different JavaScript function pointers, and so we need to implement the one that runs when you focus on the text box. So function txt title focus. And what we're doing here is basically we're going to find a reference to the control, and just on focus all we're doing is setting aside the old value. So we can declare a variable, call it control, and then we're going to use the Infragistics client-side object model in order to get reference to this control, because the control is actually a composite control. It's not just the input text box, the HTML input text box. There's some other surrounding code that gives it the rich functionality of what it is. So we need to use this special function. So it's igEdit underscore get by ID, and what we need to do is chase after the correct client ID. We don't want to just use the ID we put in the code behind. We need to see what it's generating up to the HTML. So to do that, we'll just create this expression and do txt title client ID. So once we have that, what we can do is grab our old val variable here and just do control.getValue, and that will set aside the original value when people go in and focus on the control. The next one that we need to do is the function that runs when they click. And basically at this point we're not doing much more except for changing the style sheet. So once again we want to get reference to our control, and then we're simply going to remove CSS class from this control, and we're taking out the live input. and we're going to add in the live input edit class. So basically, when it goes into edit mode, we're going to apply that dashed border around it so people get an idea that you're in an edit mode. And finally, the last function to implement, and really where most of the work is done, is the event method for the blur events. So let's call this function txt title underscore blur. And we'll get reference to our control once again. And we'll also create a new variable. We'll just call this val, and then do a control get value from here. So now what we're doing is once we blur on this text box, the idea is that someone's made some changes so we can go in and get the latest value. Once we have that latest value, we'll do something with it, but we'll also update the UI before we do anything else, just to make sure that we're representing a dirty state. So we'll do add CSS class, and we'll stick this back into live input. And we're going to remove the edit class. Now this might seem a little weird at this point because we haven't really done anything, and with these two lines here, we basically reverted the screen back to an unaltered state. And that's because the next line of code that I'm going to write is going to look and see if there really have been any changes done. So if val does not equal old val, then we're going to do something. So basically, if they are equal, then no changes have been made, and we don't need to update the UI to show that we're doing any sort of backend processing. So we're kind of preemptively getting ready for whether or not we need to make any changes. So if we're inside this if block here, then basically changes have been made and we need to do something. So the first thing that we'll do is kick off our request to the code behind in order to make the changes. So we're going to call page methods, and what that does is it's a container for the proxies that have been created for the server methods that we have that have been marked as being exposed to Ajax. So we'll call page methods and then update title. Now this is pointing to a method we haven't implemented on the server yet, but we'll get to that in just a moment. From here we'll do a $get, and what this will allow us to do is get into the value of the item that's in our hidden HTML control, and this is the primary key value, so that we're able to find the exact record immediately. We'll reach in and get the value out of here, and then we're going to pass in the val. So this is the val is the new title. And then we want to point to some functions of what to run, whether there's a success or failure. So we'll do title success, and then we'll just call this one fail, because we'll reuse it. Okay. Once that's been started, then we'll update the UI, and we will remove the CSS class from the control live input, and we'll add the CSS class live input dirty. So at this point we've made an asynchronous callback to the server, and we've updated the UI to show that it's in a waiting dirty state. And when things start to happen, it'll call back to the server and it'll run one of two functions. It will either run the title success or the fail function. So let's go ahead and implement title success. So these callback functions always have an argument, which is the response that comes from the server. And we'll go ahead and once again get reference to the control that we're working with. There we go. Now that we've heard back from the server, we can revert the UI back to the unaltered state. So let's basically just take these two lines here, and we'll reverse what we've done. So we're going to remove the live input dirty class, and we're going to add back in a live input class. Now, the way we're going to implement what's on the server, and you'll see this in a moment, is in such a way as to try and hide any exceptions that may have happened to the user. So there's still a chance that even though we're in this title success function, something still could have gone wrong on the server. So we need to take a look at our response argument here. So if we have an error, so if the response comes back as false, then what we're going to do is take our control and do a set value back to the old value. Because we want to keep since it didn't succeed on the server, we want to keep the UI updated to what's actually on the server. And then we'll pop up an alert saying that something is wrong. All right, so the server encountered an error while trying to update the title. That seems fair enough. So we have one last piece that we need to do here to complete our JavaScript, and that is to create our fail function. And this takes a response argument as well. And here is where we totally punt and just add in some nonsensical code that you would never do in a production environment. So we'll stick up an alert, and we'll say fail, and then the response. Reason being is we just don't have time to implement something that is worthy of being put in here. But what we're doing on our server method is that we're wrapping up any exceptions that have happened, and we're going to have a placeholder for publishing them. So if this runs, basically something happened on the communications end. It's not we're wrapping up any sort of programmatic error on the program side. So maybe you tell them to try again, or you'll have to decide how to handle that appropriately. But we're going to deal with exception management in a moment. You'll see how we do that. So then really the last piece that has to come forth is to implement the code behind. So we'll drop over there. And we'll do the normal types of things. So if we're on the first request of this page, then what we'll do is we need to create a variable for our book. So we use that expression in order to get the book's primary key and the input value. So I'm going to make this a protected book, and we'll just call this book. Initialize it as null, and so we can come down here and say this book equals book repository instance get book by ID, and we're going to just grab book number 1. Now, if you're not familiar with the book repository, it's a fake mock test data repository that I've created in order to make testing and demos and things like this really easy, so that we get data objects without having to worry about talking to a database. But this will also support persistence. So as we do our persistence, you'll see that we can send a book object down in the repository and it will persist. It basically loads it into the cache, so it gives you kind of the illusion of persistence. It's not real. But for our purposes, it works really well. So what we're going to do here is we should have our txt title text, and we can say this book.title. And the only other thing that we need to do at this point is go back over into our HTML, and we're going to use this expression. I think I talked about this before we actually put it in. But we'll add this expression in order to give the hidden HTML input its values. So we can say this book.id toString. So really quick here before we go on, there's a couple bugs that I needed to fix. So what you're going to see is me adding in the right CSS class and fixing a small bug within the JavaScript, and then we'll keep going. You got to put the right CSS class in. And so we'll do CSS class, and so we need live input and big. And let's just double check everything else. Oh, hey, and extra points if you caught this. This loop is wrong. This needs to be less than class's length. Okay, good. That hopefully that all looks good. Okay, so now that the expression is in there, let's go ahead and finish up our code behind. And so we'll drop back down here. So we have to implement the update title page method. So the first thing that we need to do is use the web method attribute, and that lives inside of system.web.services. So now that we've got that, we can access this attribute web method. And then our method will be public and then static. Now it has to be static because when Ajax comes back, the ASP.NET Ajax comes back and looks at this class, it doesn't create an instance of the class, it's going to look at static methods. So we need to mark this as static, and then we're going to be returning a Boolean, and it's called update title. So we'll pass in an integer for the ID and then a string for the new title. So I'm going to add in a try catch block, and the reason for that is that if you encounter any sort of exception while we're doing our work, I want to be able to hide that from the client. So especially with an Ajax type of a setup, I don't want to return exception information up to the client, because then what are you going to do with it? And good exception management would say that we would want to publish or log or notify somehow if anything goes wrong. So what we'll do is stick this in a try catch block, and then we'll declare our book. And you could decide to do this many different ways, but for what I'm going to do right now is take a look at the repository, and I'm going to get the current version of the object that we're working with. So we'll pull this out of the repository, and then we'll update the title. So that's when we've got that, we'll take it and shove it back down into the repository. So we'll say update. And then from here, basically the idea is that everything worked out well. No errors happened, so we can return true at this point. What we want to do down here at the bottom, here you'd want to publish your exceptions. And there's a lot of good resources out on the web about how to handle exception management, publishing exceptions. You want to save it to a text file, database, send an email, whatever you're going to do. But then what we'll do is we will do a return false. And then this way on the client we know something went wrong, and if you remember from our JavaScript, what we did was we set the old value back to being what the value of the control was, so that the UI matched what was in the system. Now we're going to get a little squiggly here. This isn't a huge deal, but I'm going to do system diagnostics, debug, and then write line ex.message, and this is a good place to set a breakpoint and see what's going on in case you have any problems. Now this is all working code. This is exactly what it should be, but I'm going to add one more thing, because if we don't, since all of this is on the same server, the UI is going to update so fast you'll never see any of this happen. So I'm going to sleep the thread for a moment. So we'll do system threading thread sleep, and just do 3 seconds. So let's go ahead and run this and see how it looks. So we've got the title of our book. When we hover over it, we get the green outline, which is exactly what we want. If we click into it, the outline changes to a dashed border, which is exactly what we want. So I can change this to say Craig's book. Now, when I click outside of the control, the onBlur event will happen and it'll run our function. So it'll make the callback to the server, update our repository, and then also update the UI. So let's see if it in fact does work. So there, it changed the UI for us. When we heard back from the server, it updated it again. Now I can hit refresh, and I can see that we do have persistence, all done without pressing any buttons or doing anything like that. So that's the title editor, and basically the date editor is pretty much the exact same thing with a few different permutations to it. So let's go ahead and add in the code that we need for the date editor. So we'll start with the ASPX, and there's a few things that we're going to need here. First of all, we will add in a label so that we have a place to stick the word published so we know what that date is for. So we'll do div ID equals published. And if you remember correctly that we have a style sheet entry up at the top that will give us the correct position. Now the next thing that we need is the date control, and then also a span, a container that's going to hold the current data. So create another div here, and the ID for this one will be date control. And initially we don't want to show this, so we're going to give it the class of none. And then go over to our toolbox and find the web date chooser and drag that in there. Just stick that up there within our tag there. So clean this up a little bit, and we're going to give this an ID of WDC, so web date chooser publish date. Now the next thing that we need is the little container that will hold the current data, so we'll create one more div. The ID will be date, and the class will be live input. This will give us the hover effect that we need, and then we'll create a placeholder here for when we click on this. We'll just do date underscore click, and since we're going to be affecting the CSS properties of this div right here, we'll pass in an instance of this guy so that we don't have to programmatically find an instance of it later. And so what we can do here is use another expression to say this book dot publish date short, and that's a property, a format property off of the data object that basically gives us a short date time based off of the value. So then what we need to do is create a hook in here for the JavaScript here for our onClick, but then also something that we're going to do when we change the value. We need to have some JavaScript that runs when we change the value on our web date chooser. So let's go into the design mode, and the designer is reading our style sheet as it should. So let's take out this class none, and I want to show you something you can use within the smart tag here. Go to our web date chooser, go into the properties, and find client side events. What we want to do is have something fire when the value is changed. So what we'll do is click on the drop down here and say add new handler. Now you'll see the properties window has picked up all of the JavaScript functions that are on the page, which is nice, but we don't have one set up yet, so we're going to click on add handler. So it'll come up as WDC publish date underscore value change. We'll keep that. And it also brings in the arguments that are associated with this function as well. So that's a really nice feature of the control, that it'll add all that in there for you. So I'm just going to clean this up a little bit. We don't need an extra script tag, so we'll just place it in right there. Okay, so we have two functions that we have to implement right now. So we're going to also create the one for date underscore click. So this is what will happen when someone clicks on the date itself. So the first thing we'll do is create a variable which will be a pointer to the container for the date control. So basically this div right here. So we'll call this date control. And we can do a $get off of date control. And then at this point what we're doing is basically just manipulating the style sheets. So we want to hide the date, the one that we're looking at right now, and show the date control itself. So we'll do an add CSS class to the control we're looking at right here. And we want to hide it, so we're going to add the CSS of none. And all this does, if you remember, is apply display equals none, so it hides it. We're going to remove the none CSS class from our date control. And finally, we'll add the CSS class of live input edit to the date control. Cool. Okay, so when someone clicks on that date, it'll show the date control, hide the container for the current value, and then we give it the edit look and feel that we need. Okay, so just like when we implemented the blur function for the title, all of that logic is basically going to be happening here under published, the publish date value changed. So what we need to do is have the new date. It's going to function a little bit differently. So I want to create a new variable, and we'll call this new date, and just initialize that as an empty string. And so we'll come over in here, and the first thing that we want to do is create a new JavaScript date object. And the reason is because the date that comes through in the argument here, new value, isn't the same. It's not the same format as what we want. We have to parse it in order to be able to show it on the screen like we did under the data entry portion. We have to parse it a little bit to show it on the screen like it was initially in the unaltered state. So we're going to create a new date. We're going to pass in the new value. And then the new date variable will equal a little bit of parsing that we have to do the date. So the first thing that we'll do is take a look at the date and get the month. Now this month is indexed at 0, so we're going to add 1 to the month in order to get what we need. And then from there, we will append our little slash so it looks like we want it to. And then from there, we'll look at the date again and do get date. This gives us the day of the week, or not the day of the week, but the day within the month. So that's what we want there. Another slash, and then we'll get the full year. So dt get full year. So now we have a date formatted exactly like what it looked like when before we touched anything. All right, so then we'll come in here and say that we need to take a look at the date control again. And in the same way that we did with the text, we're going to update the UI to the unaltered state. And so what we'll do now is apply the style sheet for the dirty state. So we'll do a remove CSS class on date control. And we're just going to take off the live input edit. And then we'll add a CSS class from the date control, live input dirty. And finally, now we're ready to go in and call our server-side method. So we'll do page methods, and we'll call this update publish date. And again, just like we were doing before, we'll reach into our hidden input element, book ID, to get the primary key of the item that we're working on. We'll pass that in, and we'll pass in the new value, which was brought to us as an argument to this function here. And then we'll call date success, and then we'll reuse that fail function in case something went wrong. So the last thing we have to do is implement the function for date success. And we have a response argument here. And so as you would guess, we need to get reference to that date control, so we'll go ahead and do that. We will also take a look at the dates container that holds our current value. So we've got that now. I'm going to take off the dirty state. We're going to hide our web date chooser control and show the control that will just display the data itself. So we'll look at the date control, and we're going to remove the live input dirty. we'll also remove from our date the none class. So now this will show it on its screen. And finally, we will add to date control the none CSS class to hide it off the screen. And then we'll take a look at the response. If the response comes back as true, we'll take the date and we'll say inner text equals new date. And if you remember, new date was a variable that we set aside on the value changed function. And we created a variable for that outside of the scope of the method so we could get to it here. We'll set the inner text of our date control to what the new date is. And then if the response failed, again, what we'll do is just we'll just alert out a message to the user. Alright, so the server encountered an error while trying to update the publish date. Fair enough. So there's one last thing that we need to do, and that is update the code behind. And basically we're doing exactly the same thing with update title. I'm going to copy this, paste it down here, and call this update publish date. This will be a date time. And instead of looking at title, okay, so that's what we have for our publish date. Let's go ahead and run it, cross our fingers, and hopefully everything will work out as okay, so what we need to do is I took out that display none, or assigning the class to our control because we needed to see it in order to get to the properties. So date control will start off with the class, again, of none. Good. So now we see Craig's book that's still being read out of the cache. And we see published. And I can hover over this. I'm getting the green outline, which is great. If I click on it, I get nothing because there's one more step we have to do. Come into page load, and we have to give it a value. So the published date value equals this book published date. That's better. So now when we hover over it and switch over, we get our date here. We can choose what we want. We'll just make it today's date, so 11/24/2008. Blur on that. It should update what we've got, and it should also update the UI. But we have an error down here, so let's figure out what's going on. It says it can't evaluate what's going on. Let me pause this, figure out what's going on, and I'll come back and explain it to you. Okay, I figured out what it was, and it was just a silly mistake. If you'll notice, we have a spelling mistake over here in the name of this function. So if I copy this guy and paste it in here, now run it, we should be pretty much good to go. So I can come into this date, choose a new one, we'll choose today's date, and blur out of there, and there we go. Even persisted. So that is a live form. That's implementing the live form Ajax pattern using the Infragistics controls. I hope this has been enlightening to you. I hope that hopefully you found some concepts in here that'll show you ways that you can find all kinds of uses for this. So thanks a lot for checking this out. This is Craig Shoemaker. Hopefully be talking to you soon.
Infragistics. On the web at infragistics.com.